So hi everyone, my name is Jennifer Cowan. My pronouns are she and her. I'm wearing a black dress with white polka dots. I have medium length brown hair and I'm wearing glasses. I'm coming to you from the Greater Toronto area today. It's still a little cool. We're still in winter. But today I intend to talk about some best practices on how to balance regulatory requirements with a great user experience. So today we're going to look at some of the challenges that you may encounter when balancing the needs of a user and regulatory requirements that might be set out by the government. So what we really need to understand is that it's not one or the other. These two things really have to work together, and I'll explain why throughout this presentation. But my main goal today is not to sing the praises of regulations, but rather to help provide perspective on why technical standards are important and how regulations have helped us build out an accessibility program that balances these two worlds. So there's two words that appeared on my screen. The first is accessibility, and I just kind of want to pose the question, like when you hear accessibility, the word accessibility rather, I want, what comes to mind? Maybe you think, people with disabilities, equality, inclusion. Maybe you think screen readers or mobility devices, or even ramps, user experience, or even access to. And we all have different perspectives when it comes to this word, but I think we can all agree that accessibility is not only a fundamental right, it's a big part of providing an exceptional customer experience. And so when we design with accessibility in mind, we include everyone. We open doors that may have otherwise been closed and create more inclusive experiences regardless of a person's situation or ability. But when you hear the word regulation, what comes to mind? And my guess is it's not it's not the same. You probably think things like rules, the law, government involvement, filing compliance reports. That's what I think of. Checking boxes, and maybe even this idea of perfection. I also would hazard a guess that when most of you heard the word regulations, you thought of a four-letter word, or your eyes have already glazed over and started to tune me out. And I don't really blame you, but the idea of regulations can certainly evoke feelings of ambiguity, confusion, added complication, deadlines, and likely the perception that we can't innovate in a regulatory environment. And for the record, I am not here to sing the praises of regulations, as I said. I am here to hopefully change the perception that exists where we think regulations are inherently bad and put the rules in the driver's seat at the sake of the customer. So I want to provide you with a little bit of background on how I personally look at regulations. So this is based on my own experience working with regulations over the years. And I see it as in two ways. On one hand, a regulation can be subjective, meaning that they're really open to interpretation. There aren't a lot of guidelines for these types of regulations. And as an organization, you're really left to determine how to best implement with some guardrails or principles. These types of regulations are often lacking standardization, and it really makes it difficult to determine sort of what is good, what is a minimum level of acceptance, or whether that actual requirement is successful, and thus making testing a bit challenging. And so an example of this might be the Accessible Canada Act. And in December 2021, the government released its first set of regulatory requirements. And this is applicable to the government and federally regulated organizations here in Canada, where we're required to produce an accessibility plan. I am kind of skipping over a few other regulatory requirements, but my point is really that this first set of regulations, they're principles based and therefore quite a bit more subjective, or on the subjective side, I should say. And so an example of what a principle might be, so built into the Act, is the principle of nothing about us without us. And when we think about how we meet our regulatory requirements, the idea is that our decisions or how we implement a particular aspect of a regulatory requirement aligns with this particular principle. But what does that look like in action? And so the short answer is that it can mean many different things to many different people, thus really making it subjective, right? So my interpretation of the nothing about us without us principle is that people with disabilities are included. But you might ask, well, what are they included in? How are they being included? Are we hiring people with disabilities rather to do accessibility work? Or are we hiring people with disabilities, period? Are we doing user testing on our products? Are we doing user research to know what products or to provide in the first place, or what they could look like? Is it that our decision makers have disabilities? And again, the short answer is that it can be all of these things, but it could also mean something different to another person, to a person in another department. And so when I say that these principles-based regulations really leave room for interpretation or difficult to test from an outcomes perspective, this is really what I'm talking about, because we kind of don't really know what it is that means. And therefore, we have to make a decision about what we feel that means for our organization and the work that we're doing. And so on the other hand, a regulation can be prescriptive, meaning that there is less interpretation because you're being presented with a standard. You are being told at minimum what the expectation is. So an organization must then make decisions based on these rules. And there is often clear testing methodologies and procedures to determine what is good. This type of regulation can result in sort of what appears to be more gates or controls when it's being implemented. And we'll talk about why that's not bad shortly. So if we're talking prescriptive regulations, we see this type of regulation in Ontario with the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. And that legislation has been around much longer and has one main sort of regulation split into 5 standard areas, resulting in a number of regulatory requirements for businesses and governments in Ontario. And the Ontario regulations are much more prescriptive, thus limiting what it is that what we have to do rather in order to meet the obligations. But I don't think that that limits us overall. So for example, Section 14 of the integrated standard sets a path for organizations to conform with WCAG 2.0, starting at level A and progressing to AA or AAA if you're the government. And I'm not going to get into the merit of technical standards today, but I do want to point out that this approach is very prescriptive. You know that in order to comply with Section 14, you have to conform to a technical standard, and in this case, WCAG 2.0. I was actually part of the last Information and Communication Standards Development Committee, which took place a few years ago. And when we were making recommendations, we were actually asked to look at or make recommendations that could be enforced, thus really steering us away from regulations that are more subjective and asking us to be more prescriptive with how we viewed an obligation. And that's really why we have regulatory requirements like Section 14, because it gives the government the ability to design an enforcement tool with measurable outcomes. And just as a caveat, I'm not here to speak to what those enforcement tools look like or, again, merits of those. And another example of a prescriptive standard might be a building code. So there are certain laws and codes that stipulate that what you must do in order to meet the minimum technical requirements. So when an architect, for example, designs a space, you can be sure that they do not want to design a space that is that meets building code only. But what they do want to do is make it look a certain way. And so thus providing a certain level of user experience. They may have some leeway to decide where certain features are in the overall design, but if they don't meet that minimum technical requirement, that space won't be usable. And I'm not even talking accessibility at this point. So for those of you who have ever tried to get a building permit, I think you probably understand where I'm going with this. And now I want to talk a little bit about assumptions, but continuing along this path of prescriptive versus subjective regulations. So there is a perception that a prescriptive regulation is harder to achieve or harder to meet. And maybe this is because you're being told what to do and how to do it. And if you're like me, you do not like to be told what to do or how to do things. But it seems that when our options are limited, it feels like we only have one path or one way of doing things, and therefore really limiting our ability to be creative and innovative and making it more difficult to find solution. And sort of giving this perception that there's only one way to get to done. And on the opposite side, when we have infinite options or solutions, it's going to be so easy to find a way to get to done. But I personally don't believe that to be true. I would argue that it's when our options are limited that we truly put ourselves in a position to be creative and innovate. So on the subjective side, if I asked you to go out and create something amazing right now, no guardrails, no guidelines, I think many of you would probably come back and say that you didn't know where to start, or some of you anyway. And this isn't to say that that's inherently bad, but we do have to, when we have more options, we can certainly get bogged down in defining the what and spending less time understanding the how. And so if I use the example that I gave earlier about nothing about us without us, how much time do you think is spent defining what that statement means? So less time is spent thinking about how we can implement that, and including people with disabilities, for example, and more time is spent thinking about, well, what does that mean for us within this organization? So on the prescriptive side, if I gave you a very specific problem and said, this is the problem, go and solve it, in my experience, people will, their creative juices will start to flow, and the number of options that become available to us seems to increase. And we come up with some pretty incredible solutions, at least in my experience. And so if someone were to say that nothing about us without us means that people with disabilities are always included from the start, and our products will always include user testing, as an example, this then provides us with that definition, and we can start to figure out how we will implement this particular regulatory requirement. And that's why I think prescriptive regulations and standards can actually help us build a better user experience. So moving on, I really want to dispel a myth that compliance adds complexity. And again, some of you are probably rolling your eyes at me right now, because there seems to be this idea that because we have to comply with a regulation, automatically it's going to get complicated and difficult. And trust me, I have been on those calls when it is complicated and difficult. But I think the reason that happens is because we haven't fully defined the expectations. We don't know what those definitions are. And not everyone really understands or has the same level of knowledge and awareness of these requirements. The word compliance or conformance also has a bad connotation, and it's often viewed that when we incorporate compliance, we're actually making the customer journey more complicated than it needs to be. But the way that I view compliance, as I mentioned earlier, is a series of gates and controls that help guide the work that we do. And the word control may be seen negatively, but it's really just a place for us to pause and make sure that we are on the right path. The regulations in general tend to be put in place to protect consumers in one way or another. And that means that accessibility regulations are designed to protect consumers from being excluded or discriminated. And whether that is the actual case, again, is not for me to discuss here today, but if we use that sort of thinking, compliance then is actually the mechanism that's going to ensure that standards have been met at this minimum level, and thus giving consumers rather a certain level of comfort. And this gives us the ability to be accurate when designing an experience, whether that's on the web or in real life, but it also allows for a consistent experience. And for me, that's imperative and a really big part of a user experience, in my opinion. And so if I continue with this building code example for a moment, if you're a person with a disability, a physical disability rather, and you're traveling through a city, and maybe it's a new city, standardization or consistency really helps you to be able to find the spaces that you can get into or that you can use. And so why should one washroom have a different minimum standard than another? You know, design is another matter, as I mentioned before, but standardization and consistency is extremely important, especially in the world of accessibility. And so would you want a user to go from one place on your website to another and have a completely different experience if that's not your intention? And so much so that they thought that they were on a different website altogether. So I think that when we say that compliance adds complexity, we're actually saying that it's too much effort to ensure a consistent user experience across our sites, across our pages, whatever that looks like. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and approach this from a user experience perspective. So on the slide here, there are 7 factors that influence a user's experience. There could be others. I'm just going to limit it to these for today. And those factors are useful, usable, findable, credible, desirable, accessible, and valuable. And so if these are the factors that influence a good user experience, you might wonder, how do we determine if any of these elements are achieved or are successful? And I believe that this is done through testing. I'm going to continue on this physical spaces path just to help paint the picture a little bit. So let's say you're new to an organization. It's your first day on the job, and you arrive at your new office and you're told that there is an accessible washroom. So if you look at this or think about this from a user experience, the first step is, well, where is that accessible washroom? So can we find it? What's its location? And obviously this aligns with the factor of findable. And the test might be in how you find the washroom. So is there directional signage posted that's showing you where the washroom is? Are there wayfinding cues directing you towards the accessible washroom? Is there fixed signage designating the space? And does the fixed signage indicate gender or gender neutral? So let's say none of that existed and the walls and the doors are white, and there's no markings, there's nothing telling you, what is behind that door. You can kind of tell that it's a door. Maybe there's no handle either. And so there's nothing to let us know that this is actually a washroom behind that door. So you could be walking into your new boss's office. And really, is this a good user experience? Absolutely not. Is it an accessible experience? Nope. Is the washroom findable? Still no. And in some jurisdictions, such as Ontario, this is also against the law. And so what is the solution to this? And I think that when we think about the fixed signage, right, like that is going to help us meet that minimum regulatory requirement. But there's a number of suggestions that I kind of posed a moment ago that would help someone to find that washroom, color contrast, signage, wayfinding, tactile, all kinds of things that is going to not only solve the problem from a regulatory perspective, but it's also going to help to create an exceptional user experience. So the signage alone, right, that just helps us check the accessibility box or the compliance box, doesn't make it a great user experience. In this case, we really can't have one without the other. And what I'm getting at is when it comes to digital products and services, we have to sort of view it the same way. So we need to make sure that we build the base and the foundation before adding into it. And that leads me to this next part. So on the screen here, I've got a quote that says, when we treat accessibility as a requirement box to check, we can miss opportunities to design better products and services, period. And this is absolutely true. But the part that I really want to drive home and ultimately leave you with today is that I don't think it can be overlooked. So I will pose a question. So how can we ensure that we've met our regulatory obligations while also striving to design better products and services? And I've kind of alluded to this, spoken to it a little bit. But from my perspective, I think the two really have to be seen in a partnership. We have to use the technical standards or regulatory requirements as a guardrail. This is going to help us to know where we can push the limits and where we have to draw lines. And so regulations shouldn't be seen as problems themselves, but rather a jumping off point to build those accessible experiences. We may have to say that baseline standards is all we can do here, but I think that we often stop and that becomes a bit of a roadblock. But if we say that's all I can do here for now and use that as a starting point for the next update or the next version, I think that we will innovate some truly great products and experiences. And to answer my own question, how can we ensure um, that we've met our regulatory obligations while also striving to design better products and services? And on this slide, I have a quote that says, approach accessibility as a customer experience imperative, not a compliance-driven initiative, which probably won't come as a surprise to you, but it's all in our perspective. So we really do this by creating standards for ourselves. And maybe the regulations say that we have certain standards that we have to meet. We know that's okay. But the question becomes, what else can we do, or do we want to standardize as an organization? Where can we build and grow? And so, for example, you may want to standardize the need for user testing within a product or service launch. Is user testing something that you have to do? Not in a regulatory sense, but it's certainly something you would want to do if you want the product to work for your customers. So then adding that into your standard, and in this case, you're going to get a lot of feedback, which is wonderful, but the key is iteration. So using that feedback as building blocks to keep going. So again, the regulations are sort of the minimum, or the technical standards are that minimum. And what we're hearing from customers is the way that we build to really drive that customer experience. Plain language is another thing that you may want to standardize if you can. I certainly know that this is much easier in some organizations than others. You know, there's some organizations out there where there's a lot of technical jargon, and I think that while they should not be excluded from using plain language, I think, again, we just would need to think about how an organization like that could use plain language. And really, these are just two things. These are just two ideas of things that you can standardize and how you can kind of push the envelope when it comes to the technical standards and those minimums. There's so many more ways that you can go above and beyond to help you achieve that exceptional user experience. I also want to just add that the degree to which you can create your own standards has a lot to do with the accessibility maturity level of your organization. And so maybe this work is new to you or your organization, and therefore meeting those minimum technical requirements is what you can do and really what you strive for right now. And I think that's okay. But those organizations need to have a plan in place that outlines how and when they're going to start to build on that, and really think about it from the customer perspective and not just a compliance-driven initiative. So if you're wondering what we're doing and some of the things that we've done to push the envelope, we regularly work with our compliance teams, and this is to design a sensible regulatory program and operating model. And the key word there being sensible, in that it's not too heavy on one side or another. It does give us some opportunities to expand what it is that we are trying to do, while also understanding what the minimums are. We engage executives quite a bit. We keep our eyes on emerging regulations and developing standards. We also work with government relations to make connections with certain government levels of government, so provincial and federal staff and officials. And this sort of helps us understand some of the expectations when there may be, maybe clarity may be lacking. We have a great team that understands the impact of technical standards and uses that to assess sort of what the impact will be if a new regulation or new technical standards are being enacted or introduced. And that's not always easy, but that is something that is really important to kind of ensure that we're continuing to go that extra mile. And we also use WCAG 2 as a baseline for the technical web standards. We also have a great team that does a lot of user research and collects feedback, a fabulous group. I'll give them a bit of a shout out here. And I think that's something that really takes it from, you know, the minimum from a regulatory perspective to push beyond into, you know, what can we do to help customers have an exceptional user experience. And last but not least, we have digital accessibility roles-based training. And again, a really great group that has developed and delivers this to our digital accessible, to our digital teams, I should say, not strictly accessibility. And I know that I am under time. I do talk quickly, but I just want to leave you with this one last thought, which is that the only way out is through. The more time that we spend pushing against compliance and fighting the need to meet regulatory requirements, the longer it's going to take to build an accessible and exceptional user experience. Our jobs as accessibility practitioners is really to solve problems, and standards, excuse me, standards are meant as a way to minimize or reduce the number of problems that there are to solve, in theory. So if we can all work together, we will end up with an exceptional user experience that also allows us to check those boxes and to make our compliance friends happy. That is all I have for today.
Wonderful information. Thank you so much. I especially love the quote, and I took it down, that you had up there from Gina about it being a customer experience initiative, not a compliance-driven initiative. That was perfect. That's such a great message. Thank you. All right, just a reminder, everybody, please put your questions in the Q&A section, and I'm going to go ahead and get us started in walking through those. One of the great questions, and it's two-part, was what happens when the prescriptive regulation is poorly designed or written?
That is a great question, and and unfortunately one that we see a lot. And I think that there are ways of, as I said, innovating and thinking about that particular requirement. But I think the bigger kind of response is to get involved and to kind of work within the communities so that folks understand that that is a problem to begin with, why it's a problem, why it's not working, and figure out how to, at our level, how to implement something that is of equal service or quality within that particular design.
Great. Then the second part of that question, how do you determine when to disagree or go against a prescriptive requirement, especially when disabled users are noting that the experience isn't working well?
So, we do have some leeway within within a regulation, right? So, how many of those checkboxes are we checking? And I think again, we would refer back or defer to the user experience and what is the balance between the user experience and the regulatory requirement. We also have sort of escalation procedures, risk factors that we can look at. What is the risk? We're going above and beyond in that case, from what I understand in the scenario. So I think the risk would be low to a user, but certainly we would have to sort of run that through compliance and get their 2 cents on it. So I'm not a compliance person, so I don't have an answer for that, but I think that's sort of how we would address it.
Great. Since you've created an accessibility transformation program in a big organization, this attendee wants to know what KPIs or other indicators you monitor to show senior management and different teams in the hierarchy that accessibility is progressing forward.
So this the work that I am doing is relatively new. So those are a work in progress. I don't have a good answer for that, but certainly if the individual wants to reach out, we can touch base about something more specific.
Great.
Later on.
All right. There was a great one I want to get back to here. What are the best starting points for a large organization having to comply with subjective regulation like Accessible Canada Act? What are the worst starting points?
I think it's just getting the appropriate stakeholders in the room to figure out, as I said, like, what does that principle mean? What does it mean to them? Going out to your customers and finding out what it means to them as well. I think that's the best starting point. I think the worst starting point is probably just sort of making some assumptions and tackling it based on those assumptions that maybe aren't informed.
Mm-hmm. Does framing accessibility as a customer experience imperative, that quote that I liked, potentially provide poor incentives for providing accessible experiences universally? And then also a comment after that. For example, accessibility is a right for all people, not just paying customers.
Sorry, can you repeat the first part of the question?
Does framing accessibility as a customer experience imperative potentially provide poor incentives for providing experiences universally?
I don't think so. I think that, we want our customers to have a great experience. Like, I think that's um, the message across the board. So I don't think that framing it that way is seen as a negative. In fact, I think that that is seen as a positive because that's sort of who we're designing these products and services for.
And then a comment, great information. Any suggestions on how to start the discussion with legal compliance friends to start writing disclosures in a user-friendly way?
I think it's just building those relationships, and there's always going to be a bit of a pushback from a legal perspective. So um, again, just building those relationships, having the conversation, sort of explaining, why it's important, why you feel it's necessary. And then I think the other piece is being prepared for a bit of give and take.
This one is asking for examples, so high level, of how you've used prescriptive regulation to fuel creativity for customers at your bank. Any ideas and thoughts on that one?
I don't have any examples how that's being done at the bank.
Right, I think that is all the questions that we have so far. Just going to refresh my screen here. Anybody have any other questions they want to get out there? I think that's all of them, Jennifer. Lots of great comments about a great talk, lots of good information. So thank you so very much. I really appreciated your talk today too. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.